This video was brought to you by Imprint. Slovakia isn't all that popular with the EU at the moment. Since his re-election last October, Prime Minister Robert Fico has implemented a series of controversial reforms, and earlier this month, Bloomberg and the Czech news agency reported that the Commission was considering cutting Slovakia's EU funding via the conditionality mechanism, the same mechanism used to withhold funds from Orbán's Hungary. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at how Fico returned to power after 8 years of corruption-tainted governments, why the EU doesn't like his politics, and whether Slovakia is becoming the EU's next Hungary. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop when we release new videos. First though, a bit of context. From 2006 until really quite recently, Slovak politics were dominated by Fico and his left-wing nationalist Smer party, who won 44% of the vote and the absolute majority of parliamentary seats back in 2012. However, Fico was forced to resign in 2018 following mass protests, sparked by a number of high-profile corruption scandals, especially the murder of journalist Jan Kuciak and his fiancée, who were investigating organised crime within Smer. Fico then appointed his right-hand man, Peter Pellegrini, to replace him as PM, hoping to give Smer a chance to freshen up its image. But despite these efforts, Smer failed to regain its electoral momentum. In an Orbán-esque last-ditch attempt to sway voters, the party boosted pension payments just before the 2020 election. But this wasn't enough, and Smer was defeated by the anti-corruption populist movement Olano, led by Igor Matovic. In the aftermath, Robert Fico's loyalists, including Peter Pellegrini, broke away from Smer and formed their own party, Hlas. Many had hoped that the new government, led by Matovic, would clean up the dirty state of Slovakian politics left by Smer. But whilst Matovic's government managed to purge a handful of corrupt officials, they struggled to transition from a protest movement into a proper party of governments. His chaotic governance style and apparent ego made Matovic increasingly unpopular with the Slovak public, and he ended up resigning 1 year into the job after the other parties refused to work with him. Following the opposition's unimpressive stint in power, last October Fico returned and was once again re-elected as Prime Minister, winning by a margin of 23% on a platform promising to stop supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia, pledging not to send one more round of ammunition to Kyiv. Whilst the EU raised its eyebrows over Fico's return, Hungary welcomed him back with open arms, and Orbán was no doubt glad to have someone who shared his Ukraine-skeptic politics. Then, a couple of months later, Fico's grip on power was bolstered after his ally Peter Pellegrini, who, as we mentioned earlier, briefly led Smer before leaving to create a new group called Hlas, won the presidential elections. Now, we've already made a video on how Pellegrini managed to win the presidential elections, so do check that out. But essentially, part of Pellegrini's success can be explained by his effective weaponizing of the escalating rhetoric around Ukraine at the time. As you might remember, this was when Macron was refusing to rule out sending NATO troops to Ukraine, and Pellegrini accused his liberal opponent, Ivan Korczak, of planning to send Slovak troops to fight in Ukraine, although he never actually said this, while portraying himself as the candidate of peace. This strategy worked because Slovaks are generally more Ukraine-skeptic than the European median. For instance, a poll from earlier this year revealed that only 40% hold Russia responsible for the conflict in Ukraine. And last March, a survey found that 69% of Slovak respondents believe that supplying weapons to Kyiv brings Slovakia itself closer to the war. Now, whilst it's probably unfair to label this as pro-Russian, the Slovak attitude is generally that they don't trust either side, and their priority is to avoid getting involved. Again, there's overlap with Hungary's Orbán here, who won the 2022 parliamentary elections and this summer's European elections on a similar pro-peace platform. Anyways, with Pellegrini in office and Smer back in action, Fico began ramming through multiple controversial reforms, some of which were apparently inspired by Orbán. First, Fico has taken several steps to dismantle anti-corruption institutions. These include disbanding the National Crime Agency, NAKA, which has investigated most of the prominent cases of organised crime, withdrawing whistleblower protection, and reforming Slovakia's criminal code to reduce sentences for crimes connected to corruption and fraud, which has already freed some of Fico's allies. The reformed code also got rid of the Special Prosecutor's Office, which previously dealt with the most serious corruption cases in the country, including one into the murder of Jan Kuciak, and helped convict many officials connected to Smer. As such, the reforms have been described by a current Liberal opposition member as a revenge move and a de facto amnesty for Fico's cronies. Abolishing the Special Prosecutor's Office also means that cases would be transferred to the General Prosecutor's Office, led by Maroš Žilinka, who has in the past dropped charges against Fico and his allies. Secondly, Fico has worked to dismantle media and civil freedoms. In April, Fico decided to scrap the public broadcaster RTVS, arguing it was politically biased and in conflict with the Slovak government, and replaced it with a new public server broadcaster. Again, Fico seems to be copying Orbán's media playbook here, which involves gaining political control of the public broadcaster and the national media regulator, before encouraging your political allies to buy up private media, giving you a de facto monopoly and leaving the remaining independent journalists with a fraction of the resources and reach. Thirdly, earlier this year, Fico introduced a foreign influence law, which again mirrors a similar piece of legislation introduced by both Orbán and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Under the bill, NGOs have to be registered as organisations with foreign support if they receive more than €5,000 a year in foreign funding. Now, Fico's crackdown intensified following a dramatic turn in May, when he was shot multiple times outside a cultural centre in Handlova. Although he survived the assassination attempt, he blamed the, quote, Soros media and NGOs, vowing to take revenge, and then this week removed the opposition leader from his parliamentary position, allegedly due to his connections with the liberal-leaning media. Unsurprisingly then, none of this has gone down well with the EU. And as we mentioned in the intro, earlier this month it was reported that the Commission were considering cutting Slovakia's EU funding, either via the conditionality mechanism or by withholding some of the €2.7 billion from Slovakia's recovery and resilience plan. This leaves Fico with broadly two options. The first of these is that he could drop some of the reforms, as he actually has done in the past. In July, Fico cracked under EU pressure and revised some elements of his criminal law reforms. The other option is to follow Orbán in fighting back against the Commission by doing stuff like threatening to veto further aid to Ukraine. This would obviously be pretty terrible news for Brussels, which has long struggled to handle Orbán's obstinacy, but it would also be a risky strategy for Fico, given that about 80% of Slovakia's public investments are financed by EU funds, and that, even with the help of EU funds, Fico is currently running an unsustainably large deficit representing about 5% of GDP. Now, fans of TLDR, like you, care about understanding the world around them. And that's where today's sponsor, Imprint, comes into play. If you care about building a life of learning, then Imprint is the app for you. It's a brand new way to learn, built from the ground up. And seriously, unless you've used the app before, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, bite-sized and interactive learning experience. It's the perfect antidote to a world where social media tries to keep us mindlessly dopamine scrolling day in, day out. Their library includes courses on topics like psychology, history, philosophy, finance, productivity, and many more, and quick reads that you can consume in a single setting. In fact, I've been using the Essential Philosophy Theories and Thinkers course, and it's been an excellent way to brush up on some knowledge from university that I genuinely thought I lost. With all the developments happening these days, from elections to AI to geopolitical tensions, it's been helpful to revisit some of the world's greatest thinkers. So make yourself feel better about your screen time, build a real habit of learning every day, and join the millions of people using Imprint. Plus, if you use the link in the description, the first 200 people will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know that you came from us.